Welcome in, Calley. I'm going to play a sound
Hello.
effect here. Boom. What's going on? Looking good in the suit. You've been wearing those a lot these days.
A lot of the tech folks have been brushing off the suits these days and coming to DC.
Uh,
So it's been
um,
nice to go down to the closet.
how do you stay healthy when you're in DC? Do you have a do you have a workout routine, a couple favorite restaurants, or you just, 5 coffees a day, no breakfast or lunch?
I would love to say I'm on the True Med Good Energy program, but the sleep has been lacking. I will say, trying to find good food, but not eating much. Just a lot
Yeah.
of caffeine.
Yeah, I bet. Let's jump right into this food dye ban. I'd love to get your high level take on it. It seems, the big question. We're a technology and business. There you go,
Yeah.
looking good. We focus on business, and my big question is how manufacturers will respond to the ban, given that it's hard enough to even just deliver on the existing demand that they have, much less make fundamental changes. And to be clear, I'm very much in favor of the ban, but I'm curious what you think this kind of looks like in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I'll back up a little bit. I think there's a lot of lessons for business in this environment we're in right now. But I never expected to be here. I'm at the White House now. I'm a special government employee, as well as running TrueMed with Justin Mayers. And Justin and I, started this company on the mission of. I think a lot of founders do this. We just wanted to impact the world and change health incentives. And just through the advocacy, Justin and I going on podcasts and talking about this, something started resonating on this idea that our healthcare and food systems are broken in the past year. Got to know Bobby Kennedy, got to know President Trump, helped connect them for the endorsement. Now coming on and helping to advise the next couple of months. But I think the big lesson of this food dye ban, I don't even know if I really like the word ban. I like phase out because ban
Yeah,
implies overregulation. And I think what people are waking up to is there's mass distrust of legacy industry right now. I mean, I talk a lot about the food industry. It was run by the cigarette industry in the 1990s. A few people remember this, but 50% of the US food supply was controlled by Philip Morris and RJ Reynolds in the
wow.
early 1990s. They consolidated the food industry when smoking rates were going down. They were actually some of the largest companies in the world in the 80s, like highest market caps. Yeah. And some of the biggest balance sheets in history of capitalism, tobacco companies. It's a good business, nicotine. And they consolidated Kraft, US Food, Nabisco, and very deliberately bought off the USDA to recommend the food pyramid, which is basically a recommendation for ultra processed food. And they shifted very strategically thousands of scientists from the tobacco department to the food department and really added all these chemicals in our food to make them hyper addictive. So through that corporate capture and what I would call the weaponization of food, today in America, a child's diet is 70% ultra processed food. In Japan or Italy, it's 15%.
Wow.
So my big argument is that we don't really have a free market with these outcomes where, of course, the disease rates are just skyrocketing. I mean, the stats are crazy. We're digging into this for a report for the administration. We spend 5 times more per capita on healthcare than Spain, but live 6 years less. I mean, and Spain
Wow.
doesn't even have a good healthcare program. So these are common sense actions, and I think there's a moment. I'm meeting with a lot of food companies, a lot of pharma companies, and they're running scared because Americans have lost trust. I mean, we all know this. I think it's why there's such a robust, tech ecosystem building and startup ecosystem. It's because these large companies have really lost trust with the American consumer and the American public. I think often for good reason. So I would call this not as much a ban, it's a correcting of corrupt incentives where these food dyes, I mean, just total no-brainer. They're petroleum based. They're literally crude oil. They add a molecule to crude oil, make that bright neon color, and they're phased out of essentially every other country. So it's an example of common sense actions that I think
So,
are
so
quite needed.
that phase out in other countries, does that mean that a lot of these manufacturers fully have the ability to sell these products and make, these products to sell into the US market, and they're just choosing not to for the most part?
Oh, it's even more shocking than that. They actually often make the product in the United States. So Kellogg's makes Fruit Loops. with carrot juice and watermelon juice and ships them across the border to Canada and ships them over to Europe. They make the same product with petroleum-based dyes here in the US. So a lot of our food can actually be exported to Europe based on just the chemicals in them right now. So actually the US food companies are, yeah.
What is it a margin thing? You know, is it
just economic incentives?
Is it purely economics or is there something else?
Yeah, the food dyes, again, I think this is one of the most no-brainer, unimpeachable things they could start with, because it's actually not a cost thing. We've done a lot of engagement with the food industry on this. Actually, they've done a lot of research, and they actually cite this as a reason for why they should keep it. They say, well, the kids in focus groups lunge for the neon bright colors. And it's like, well, I'm sure they do, but you're feeding them crude oil. So it's really actually, they say it's consumer preference. And actually, when pushed before, the food industry said, well, we believe in consumer choice and kids prefer these bright colors. So that's one reason I think the administration and Secretary Calley started with the food dyes.
My 3-year-old would love to eat cake for dinner every single night, but that doesn't mean that he should have, the autonomy to just make that decision himself as a 3-year-old.
Yeah. How do you think about the history here with like corn subsidies? Is there a risk of like playing whack-a-mole as the government decides what to push or what to incentivize? What do you take away from not just what the food companies have done historically, but what the government has done historically to kind of like steer the food supply in one direction or another?
Yeah, so I've been an entrepreneur for more than 10 years, but I grew up in DC, started my career, early on as a lobbyist for the food industry. And we used to weaponize this nanny state argument and say, you don't want to be a nanny state. But what I really have been trying to communicate, and particularly to, frankly, a rightward audience, going on Tucker and Joe Rogan, things like that. What I've really been trying to do is articulate that this is not a nanny state regulation issue. It's a correction of corruption. When you look at agriculture subsidies, more than 90% go to corn, soy, and wheat, which are essentially the components of ultra-processed food. And the grocery lobbyists and the food lobbyists push for that because at a supermarket, when you can put something in a box and it lasts forever and it's bright neon colors, the profit margins are much higher, whereas natural food is low. So there's a huge incentive to shove ultra-processed food down our throats, which has led to agriculture incentives that make a Coke at a supermarket cheaper than water because the Coke has so much subsidized ingredients in it. So that's not a free market. That's totally rigged. 90% to corn, soy, wheat, 0.4% of subsidies go to fruits and vegetables. Then you get to something like SNAP, the food stamp program. Now, Elon's looking at this. This is the fourth largest entitlement program. It's $140 billion a year. The number one item on food stamps is soda, and more than 60% go to ultra-processed food. We're the only country in the world where a low-income nutrition assistance program goes to soda and Twinkies. So you have, go down the list. School lunches, the largest source of calories for kids, federally funded, no nutrition guidelines whatsoever, no sugar limits. So you've actually just very deliberately, from the history of the tobacco companies really weaponizing these regulations. By my calculations, it's been $1 trillion over the last 10 years of subsidies to ultra-processed food. So we're trying to take step-by-step common sense actions to kind of unwind that. I also, quite frankly, think there's a cultural awakening happening where people realize the system is pretty screwed. And, hopefully, we were talking about it more. We're talking about it on a tech podcast. So the fact that people are trying to be healthier, reading labels more, Justin's talking a lot about this, obviously, I think that's a good thing too. And very unexpectedly, I do think President Trump, Bobby Kennedy, you wouldn't have expected this coalition. They're leading to an awakening where 24 states right now are passing legislation on food ingredients, school lunches. So I think it's very positive what's happening.
Yeah, I always thought it was fascinating that the food issue is it's secretly very bipartisan. Because because you get like the right wing like trad folks who want to clean up the food supply, but then you also get like the left wing hippie who's hanging out at the farmers market and is just like, I grew these vegetables myself. They're way better than the processed foods. So
I'm curious.
Like, there should be a coalition there.
Is food and health as political as it seems in the news? I feel like if you talk to people individually, it's like John said, it's bipartisan. Like
Yeah.
we want everybody to be healthier, and then you get into Washington, and it feels like
really partisan.
you mentioned you started your career in the lobbying space. So I'm curious, like where you think it's if it's actually a political issue for the average citizen, or it's just sort of manufactured by special interest groups.
Oh, there's zero reason food and poisoning our kids should be political. And frankly, these things about reforming food stamps, and taking the dyes out of our food were leftward issues, 5 to 10 years ago. Digging into the health issue, I think one of the most pernicious and chronic conditions in America is Trump derangement syndrome. And I think TDS has led many people on the left to reflexively be opposed to these common sense policies. Probably a lot of the tech folks listening. I know politics is complicated. There's a lot going on, a lot of change happening. My hope is that we can all come together on these MAHA policies. I mean, these are absolute no-brainer. It's taking on incentives of the pharmaceutical industry, which is something the left used to talk a lot about. It's taking on the interest of, processed food makers that are really doing some harmful things for kids. But you've had a wild situation where you've had Democrats now passionately arguing to keep food dyes in the food. You've had Democrats passionately arguing that we need to continue to have a $10 billion subsidy from the federal government to soda companies on SNAP, just reflexively because the Trump administration happens to be talking about this. You've had almost no support from Democrats. I called out Cory Booker, a senator from New Jersey, who I've worked with before, I've met. I know he cares about these issues. Where the hell is Cory Booker? Why wasn't he at the Health and Human Services Department on Tuesday when Secretary Kennedy was announcing this policy on food dyes? Where is he helping on these issues? I mean, this is as bipartisan as it gets.
How much does pharma's position end up influencing media narratives? They obviously spend an exceptional amount advertising with different media companies. This has been, maybe a big issue in mainstream television where, a television network is not going to, bring somebody on to talk poorly about a company that, is a big sponsor. If you wanted to come here and talk negatively about Ramp, we'd probably change the conversation.
I have nothing negative. I have nothing negative to say about Ramp. We love Ramp.
Fantastic.
Of course. But how is that a focal point at all? Do you think we need some reform there, or is it just the sort of free market doing the free market?
Yeah, this is how this framework I have, and so privileged to be fighting this fight with Justin and with TrueMed and trying to help the administration. But I think what we're doing with the strategy is we're putting a stake in the ground that everyone can agree with, where that in 10 years, our incentives of our system are changed. And the way I define those incentives is that nobody wants this, but the fact is the healthcare system, a lot of health startups, quite frankly, still, their business model is predicated on more people being sick. The pharmaceutical industry makes more money when people are sicker for longer periods of time. Hospitals make more money when the beds are full, not when they're empty. Insurance companies actually make more money when people are sicker because of this horrible medical loss ratio issue where they actually have an incentive to raise premiums. So you actually have every single lever of the healthcare system predicated on sickness. Now, that same system, the pharma industry particularly, is the lifeblood of news advertising, over 50% for most news channels. So that creates not a direct, there's not a direct edict going down, but you have a zero lack of curiosity from the media about why people are getting sick. It's really just referees about, hey, you need to take this drug. Ozempic is the standard of care for kids. With COVID, I mean, COVID was a metabolic health crisis. We were 16% of COVID deaths and 4% of the world's population. And the CDC said at the time, it's because our immune systems are so weak, we're dying very quickly when we get this disease. Yet the media it was just about the COVID vaccine for 6-month-olds. So you do have a very, very damaging situation where there's self-censorship. And the strategy is to get to that long-term world where new startups are thinking about how to make people healthy, not how to take advantage of a system and, deliver direct to consumer Ozempic or, a better UX on medical records. A better UX on medical records is putting lipstick on a pig. The problem is the underlying incentives of the system. Shipping pills in a millennial pink packaging is an innovation. You know, a lot of healthcare startups are just wrappers on the existing broken health incentives that are destroying the country and going to bankrupt us. So that's the stake we have. The way we get there is let's do unimpeachable things. So this food dye thing is one. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about pharmaceutical ads. Secretary Kennedy and Marty McCary, the amazing new FDA commissioner, have talked about that. No announcements right now, but that's, you know, something they've said they're clearly looking at. So it's just getting these things that are 90% support issues, bipartisan issues, and I think you'll be seeing them in rapid succession, these announcements.
Yeah. Does the media, you know, incredible growth of drugs like Ozempic scare you? Obviously being overweight is unhealthy. That's you know, not a political point, but when I hear people, you know, saying that they're sort of like losing more muscle than, you know, fat, that can be that personally is you know, can be concerning. And then I'm curious if you have a general, you know, just personal opinion only on this sort of balance between like compounding and getting drugs that are benefiting people out quickly and affordably versus like, you know, protecting the intellectual property of the companies that, you know, develop these drugs.
Great question. So on the first one, I'd say the MAHA stance of Ozempic, as best I can define it, my personal opinion, is there's nothing wrong with GLP-1s or Ozempic per se. Actually, I think something the administration is talking a lot about, it's not an anti-drug stance. I think with the dawn of AI and very exciting things, quite frankly, in therapeutics, there should be robust innovation and frankly deregulation at the FDA. The problem is that with the existence of Ozempic, it's two problems. One is that the drug costs 10 times more than it does in Germany or Sweden. So, and that's going to come from US taxpayers. So there's a real corruption in the pricing. And then number two, corruption in the standard of care, what I call it. So there was a Medicare ruling from Biden that said that Ozempic should be the frontline defense for anyone who's obese or overweight on Medicare. So you know, a 15-minute appointment, you get your Ozempic, and
instead
then that
of diet
ruling,
or exercise, right?
right? No, didn't even mention it. And there's no funding for diet. So we spend $5 trillion on healthcare, right? And then they were going to push this through where Ozempic's over $1,000 a month, which would come from taxpayers.
Yeah,
not with no other option or no other route for an American to get, you know, the blood testing to understand their nutrient deficiencies or talk to a dietary coach. You know, this is what Truman did. Why would you put that flag in the ground? It's like there should be flexibility with where healthcare dollars can go. So the problem, you know, is not that Ozempic exists. It's that Medicare ruling would have gone to Medicaid and would have gone to kids, because now it's being essentially pushed on 6-year-olds through the American Academy of Pediatric. So you're getting to a world where, you know, STAD rates, metformin rates, antidepressant rates have exploded among teens. 35% of teens are on some kind of chronic disease drug. You know, Ozempic would just be added to that repertoire. And of course, that's just not from our medical system incentivizing the root cause. I mean, maybe somebody that's 75-year-old on Medicare, who is, you know, 400 pounds and extremely diabetic and set in their ways. Sure. I mean, probably Ozempic. I'd be fine with Medicare funding for that. But for the vast majority of the American people, that shouldn't be the first line defense. That's the problem with our healthcare system right now. There's not flexibility for patients to maybe work with a functional medicine doctor or figure out a more root cause intervention, because obviously obesity is not an Ozempic deficiency.
That's a great quote.
Yeah. What countries do you look at as models? The tech industry loves to poke fun at Europe. You know, they don't tend to make $9 trillion companies very often, or ever in the last.
They also don't win a lot of bodybuilding competitions. We are the most obese country, but we also America also wins a lot of bodybuilding competitions.
John's point of view, but what can we, you know, what are you looking at in terms of like, this is a, you know, functioning government in the context of personal health?
That's really interesting.
So I don't like giving Europe any credit whatsoever, and they don't deserve much. And I will just say, this is a key point. Europe's healthcare systems are total basket case systems. They're terrible socialist systems. So I think one of the things we can learn from other countries.
Just to be clear, the stuff.
But
the stuff they get right is like saying like, hey, we don't want this dye, we don't want glyphosates. You know, they get a little.
Exactly.
They get a little
Actually, what they get right is that the healthcare system is less important is that people are healthier to begin with. The problem with the US healthcare system is not that we have the wrong Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement rates. It's the fact that we're the sickest country in the world. And that's actually because we rely too much on the healthcare system. So what I like about some other countries, in Japan, and I think we need more of this, and Bobby Kennedy is pushing this more. I mean, if your kid is obese, you are shamed as a parent. Like, it is totally society unacceptable. Like, you are shunned. Like, you're like yelled at by the school. Like, I think we need that same type of energy in America. Like, children should not be fat and diabetic, like, period. Like we have totally lost our way. Right now, there's a whole TikTok craze where they're shaming doctors for weighing patients or even talking about weight. Obesity is a blaring warning sign that our cells aren't working. And it is not, I do not blame the individuals. When 80% of American adults are overweight or obese, we have a systemic problem. But from the culture, we shouldn't accept that. We should absolutely be declaring that we do not want to have childhood obesity or diabetes and have that culture. Additionally, in Japan and Italy and some of the European countries, there is like total bipartisan just consensus. This sounds so obvious, but it's not the case in the US, that we shouldn't be poisoning kids. I mean, the school lunches in America are an absolute dumpster fire. And in Japan and Italy and France has mandated at daycare a 4-course meal, including a cheese course. I think French. A cigarette and wine afterwards. I mean,
That's great.
But that'd be healthier than what they serve in America. I mean, it's absolute disaster. So there is just this cultural thing around food. One thing I look at Europe, they spend 3 times less on average per capita on healthcare, but 2 times more per capita on food in Europe. They do have a lot more respect for their agriculture system and their farmers, and the consumption of whole food there is much lower. The thoughts about pesticides and what's going on in the food. So you always hear, you go to Italy, you eat the pasta, you eat the gelato, you lose weight. I mean, that's really true. So I think what needs to happen, and what I hope culturally happens with these step-by-step wins, is we move culturally to a system that puts less emphasis on getting sick and then getting drugged, and more emphasis on what I really think is a spiritual issue of having more curiosity and awe about what we're putting in our body, our environment, how that impacts the soil, how that impacts the food, and then just getting back to basics on, not poisoning kids.
Is there anything that the government can do, or even America could do about on the fitness side of things?
Yeah, what happened to the presidential fitness test? It got kind of phased out. There was a new program
that's
in 2013.
half of the battle here. We're addressing a lot of the diet and the food supply stuff, but fitness is extremely important. But it's harder to incentivize or to subsidize. Maybe I don't know. What is your take on fitness?
Well, I was just with Secretary Kennedy in Miami at a UFC fight, and Shaq was there and a bunch of A-list celebrities talking about how they can help encourage youth fitness and rejuvenate. So I don't want to get in front of any announcements here, but I think that type of education and inspiration among kids for more fitness, to not be, I mean, a boy in America, a teenager boy in America has less testosterone than a 68-year-old man. Like there's been a depletion of testosterone among kids. Obviously, because of our food or sedentary lifestyle, we're soft. I mean, 77% of military-aged youth cannot join the military in America right now. It's a national security crisis. So my 1-2 kind of framework in my head is, let's get the wins like the food dies, but you can't undercount the cultural education elements to this. Bringing what Justin Mayers and Mark Hyman and a lot of people have been talking about this for a long time, bringing that to the forefront, these common sense solutions. So you're going to see a lot of initiatives. And one thing I'm excited about is when Secretary Kennedy was sworn in by President Trump, he signed an executive order. And on May 22nd, in about a month, they're releasing a 100-day report on the chronic disease crisis, why kids are getting so sick. It's going to say things that the U.S. government's never said before about environmental toxins, about our water quality, about our food quality, about our sedentary lifestyle. So getting the facts down and having the conversation on a factual basis, and not letting industry, and I'll say this, a lot of people in industry lobby not on policies, but actually to prevent transparency about what's happening. There's pressure, to not talk about pesticides. There's pressure to, not talk about certain topics because it's going to scare consumers or it's going to confuse consumers. There is a good trend right now where the government is going to talk about anything they want to, and they're going to give Americans information, not infantilize the American people as we often do. And I think that's the necessary precondition for a long-term conversation about policy change to systems that are going to bankrupt the country and cause us to cease to exist, which is, I think, is true given the trajectory of our healthcare budget, which will bankrupt us, and the decimation to American competitiveness when you have 50% of teens overweight or obese and 38% of teens pre-diabetic.
Those kind of numbers are so shocking living in California or any, if you live in California and New York, it's just, you would never believe those numbers. You have to go to places that where wellness is not, the number one trend. I'm curious, do you think this movement around making America healthy would have been possible before decentralized media? It feels like we kind of needed podcasts, we needed social media, we needed people. We needed like a mom, some random place to discover that when she removed red dye from her kid's food, that this thing happened, and then she shared it, and people start collaborating. So I feel like, a lot of this movement just would have been impossible when you only could get your news from magazines or newspapers or radios that are all captured in some way by, large corporates.
No, the independent media ecosystem is an absolutely necessary condition to the opportunity we have right now. It can't be overstated how destructive it is that our core information source has been co-opted by an industry that profits from Americans being sick, and that's had devastating consequences. I think what's happened with independent media is one of the major historical events in American history. Like when you read about the American Revolution, it was really propagated by the ability to easily print pamphlets, and Ben Franklin and others, getting ideas out that have never been able to get out before in a mass way. I think this is a huge shift. I mean, since World War II, we've had a corporate-owned, essentially, media, and now we're able to, you guys and people at a microphone are able to get more distribution than CNN. Secretary Kennedy, was called a whack job by everyone. Actually, him and President Trump are the two most popular political figures in America still. He was able to get through on independent media, podcasts like Joe Rogan. And actually Americans, determined, a lot of them, that he actually makes a lot of sense with what he's talking about, really about these overarching incentives of healthcare. I can't stress that enough. There's in this building, in the White House, there's a shift happening where we are, of course, talking about healthcare policy, like what to do on Medicare and Medicaid, but it's more about the foundational incentives. What is the logic of where the $2 trillion we spend on Medicare and Medicaid going? Is that straight to drugs, or is it more root cause interventions? How are we incentivizing our food system? Are we really incentivizing ultra processed food for kids? Is there enough transparency for Americans to make the best decisions? There's more foundational topics being asked, and those are very disruptive topics to the legacy industry. And that's all because of independent media. I'll say the independent media also rightfully has led to record distrust of our major institutions, from, frankly, the education system, lots happening with Harvard right now, to the pharmaceutical industry, to others. That's warranted. And one of the leverages I think there is for change is that these industries, when I meet with them, really acknowledge that they have to make some major changes, really partner, frankly, with Secretary Kennedy, not to do any Secretary Kennedy or President Trump any favors, because they actually have to make changes to maintain their legitimacy with the American people. I mean, it's not working right now. I mean, some of the tech bros on Twitter are saying how incredible, recent American healthcare innovation, how it's been. I'd love to see what they're talking about. I mean, we literally have life expectancy declining. We spend 4 to 5 times more than other countries. Chronic disease rates, every single one, is at a record high this year in America, with the highest rate of chronic disease than any country in human civilization. I don't know what they're looking at, but we're not in a good situation right now.
How do you think about timelines? You're, special government employee for a limited period of time. This is obviously a monumental task. It's not something that can be solved even in a single admin. How do you think about, making sure that, obviously, we were headed to a really bad place from a nationwide health standpoint, from an economic standpoint, due to the consequences of those health issues. But what's the strategy to make sure that this sort of movement becomes bipartisan and kind of can live on after you guys are no longer in the White House?
I personally think we need to think about it as a 12-year strategy. We're not going to reorient the incentives of the largest industry in America, the fastest growing industry in America, because we're getting sick, the most employed industry in America. We're not going to change those incentives overnight or even in the next 4 years. I think what we need to do, what I'm focused on, is maintain the political coalition of what you call this MAHA coalition. The reason we're able to drive change is because millions of women, quite frankly, moms voted for Trump for the first time, people who would have never considered voting for Trump years ago. This issue has galvanized voters into a coalition. President Trump was 50-50 among young people, 50-50 among independents. We couldn't have imagined that 4 years ago. So multiple factors for that, but clearly this MAHA kind of energy led to that. So the reason we have an opportunity for change is because voters have really galvanized around this issue. So to me, if we can solidify that coalition is going to continue to drive change. So we need to deliver wins for the next 2 years. I mean, I'd love for Democrats to compete for those voters. They've had their head in the sand. If those voters can help Republicans, which is my hope in the midterms, I think you have 2028 where both sides are basically arguing who's more MAHA, which I think is a positive thing. I think we've shifted the paradigm of health. You know, before last year, healthcare was about how to add more people to the existing broken system. That's insane. You had Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren just a couple months ago during the confirmation hearings with Bobby Kennedy, eviscerating him for taking on pharma companies. Elizabeth Warren actually said, you know, you're going to hurt their profit margins, these poor companies. People have lost their minds when it comes to healthcare, somehow arguing that more resources, more spending to this broken system is how we solve it instead of actual core reform of the system. I want to get political victories and change the overall bipartisan way we talk about health. And I will say, everyone talks about the special interest, the money. The one thing that counteracts that is voters really voting on this issue. And now you have MAHA moms and people waking up, caring about this issue as a voting topic. So as long as that's solidified, you'll have momentum that changes the incentives of healthcare, where we can look back in 12 years and we have a thriving pharmaceutical industry, but they are incentivized to promote longevity. They're incentivized to cure diseases, not just manage them. All pharma's profits right now are managing. And you know, we have an overall healthcare ecosystem that's more value-based, that's more geared towards keeping people healthy, which can happen.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, there does feel like a way to flip the incentive where the pharmaceutical companies are like, if we can just keep this person alive for another 100 years, imagine how much, how many drugs we can sell them.
They should make a lot of money for that. Like imagine the impact of the economy if they could do that. Like they should make a ton of money for that. And they tell you off the record, right? They'd love to do that, but the incentives are all about disease management. So this isn't a free market right now, and there's a real opportunity to nudge these incentives to a different direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, thank you for the work that you're doing.
Yeah,
and making the time.
Thanks, guys.
I think you're doing very important work.
Yeah, we'll
Cheers.
talk to you soon. Thanks.
Talk to you soon, guys. Bye.
Later.
Bye.